Good morning, plant breeding breeders, plant breeding enthusiasts, plant scientists, people who want to learn about how to breed crops and be successful. Today we're going to talk about play number 1 in the Plant Breeders Playbook, which is kind of an inclusive topic, germplasm. And before I dig into the kind of the bones of the story, what is germplasm? How do we acquire the best germplasm for your program, for your specific program, not just overall? How do you evaluate the germplasm that you're interested in the most? And then how do you begin breeding with it? So I'm going to say a little bit about my company, Cornhusker Hybrids LLC, located here in Lincoln, Nebraska, USA. We are a global plant breeding consulting and maize genetics company with operations in several countries besides the US. But my mantra, and actually I have trademarked in the US, is the simple statement that success starts with the seed. And if you're in agriculture and you're trying to grow crops and you're trying to develop crops and you're trying to reduce food insecurity, the seed is really, really the big deal. So today I'm going to talk about germplasm, which is the number 1 play in the Plant Breeders Playbook. And I'm going to talk about it from the start with, like beginning with the end in mind. So think about your germplasm, where you want it to be in the end of your career or in 10 years, one cycle, lifetime, however you choose to think about it, depending on what your position is and how you feel about it, whether you work for a company or a large university or whether you're with some independent organization, all those things will come into play. But when I talk about beginning with the end in mind, I kind of go back to a book by Steve Covey about 7 habits of highly successful people. And I think it was habit number 3 was begin with the end in mind. And the really touching thing about that statement is the chapter started at your funeral. And you were there in some capacity and you could hear and experience all that was going on at your own funeral. And what would you want people to say and what would you want them to think? And it was really a sobering experience. Well, germplasm's a lot like that because your career is kind of on the line here, folks. I mean, you need to choose the right germplasm because I don't care who your research director is, whether you have 1 million plots or not, how many SNPs you can have, how great your scientists are, and how good your statistical analysis are. If you don't have the right germplasm, all of that's not going to matter because you're going to lose in the end because someone will have better germplasm and they will have all those other things that you do. So the germplasm is really the most important decision a plant breeder or a plant breeding organization ever makes. And if I was a teacher, I'd stomp my foot twice, ever makes. Now, what is germplasm? Well, simply put, it's just the stuff or the raw material for your breeding program that's going to drive this breeding program into the vision that you have for it. So what is germplasm? Well, it could be like any forms. It could be a synthetic. It could be a hybrid. It could be inbred lines. It could be polyploids. It can be numerous things. You can clonally propagated materials. Any of those things, turf grass, strawberries, blueberries, pineapples. And the list goes on and on. Anything that's a plant that people breed, there's germplasm. Sweet potatoes, cassava, potatoes, the list goes on and on. Broccoli. So there's germplasm for all of this. And if you're running a program, product development program or product improvement program for any of these crops, you're going to have choices on germplasm. Sometimes it may be extremely limited and sometimes it may be quite wide depending on what crop it is, how popular it is in the world, and whether the material you're looking at is encumbered or unencumbered. And what I mean by encumbered is someone else owns the IP on it, intellectual property, and you don't want to work with that and do all the work for the amount of time you're going to do it and then owe somebody else some money. So all those things come into play. Well, how do you acquire germplasm? Well, you have to find it. Well, where are you going to find it at? Well, universities, national research organizations, gene banks, gene pools, as farmers, if you were in Africa, you could just go to someone's farm and get some maize and start breeding with it if you wanted to. Other crops, cinnamon, of course, depending on the crops you're working with and where they're at, is a huge source of germplasm, because even though it's not free, maybe necessarily like it used to be, it's pretty close to it, and you're allowed access to it. And that's a really big deal. Whether you're working with cassava or pigeon peas or wheat, wherever, you've got to find a place to get your germplasm. And sometimes there's not going to be that many places. Like in the U.S., there's the USDA, there's the university programs, there's private programs of any kind of definition. So other countries is similar. They'll have a National Agricultural Research Organization like Uganda does, or SARI, S-A-R-I, like Ghana does, or somewhere where there's breeding programs where you can acquire germplasm for different crops. And I think like in northern Ghana at SARA, they work with like 18 crops. So in Africa, that's a big place. You know, you have IITA, you have IRRI, you have SIOP, you have these places. So those are the places where you have to go. Now, then it becomes, okay, you know what germplasm is, you found some germplasm that you can use. Now, I don't know what kind of limits you're going to have, because in the U.S. things are really locked up and a lot of people own most everything. But even in maize here, we're able to have plant variety protected lines that are commercial lines or near commercial lines coming off of patent, anywhere from 18 to almost 30 years after they went on patent, depending on what all happened. But they're excellent sources of germplasm for maize. And there's other crops as well. Other countries, it's a different situation. Okay, so how do you acquire the best? Well, a lot of materials in the world have been, the genome's been sequenced. There's phenomic information. I know like the major crops, I believe, like maize, wheat, rice, potatoes, some of these major crops, probably the genomes of a lot of the progenitor lines, populations, or materials have been sequenced. There's phenotypic, phenomic, or phenotypic data for those, so you can get some information about how they're going to perform, or if you're looking for a certain traits, a certain quality trait, a certain disease trait, what your market need is the end, your goals and breeding strategies of your program and your crop. And then you've got to acquire the best germplasm that you can for that. And it's also got to be, you know, the amount of germplasm that you can work, that you have a budget to work with. So that's, you know, sometimes awful restrictive too. Maybe it takes you 4 or 5 years to screen all the germplasm you want to look at. Well, you just screen 1/5 of a year for 5 years or something, and you just keep moving forward and start breeding as you have materials. But how do you evaluate the germplasm? Well, of course, everyone knows you're going to evaluate it somehow, right? You're going to do some kind of an experiment. You know, if you're looking for a quality trait or something like that, or maybe a seedling trait or things you can see, it makes it a lot easier when you're working with a trait, let's just say yield in maize or cassava or other crops you can think of, rice, wheat, and you know, at the end of the day, what you're producing in your market segment is dry grain over the scale, as much of it as you can for the least you can. So it depends on how you're going to evaluate your germplasm, but you know, there's a lot of ways to do it. Of course, you know, you can do some studies with genomics and use it to predict the rest. You have that information, maybe you can do that. Or, you know, the number one trait in the world for any crop, anywhere, at any time is what? Hear it? Drought tolerance. The ability to withstand dry periods, extremely dry and hot periods, and still produce grain or forage at the end. So that can be a screen you can do if you have a situation where you can, we call it, you know, maximum production, and then we call it limited irrigation. So irrigated, limited irrigated, where we hold water back intentionally to reduce the yield of crop. And so we can figure out, and those are extremely discriminative tests. And other things you can do is you could have disease screening nurseries, insect screening nurseries, go with maturities. You're going to have a certain maturity. That's going to eliminate a lot of your germplasm. So at some point, you're going to end up with some germplasm. You're going to have a project, and you're going to have some money to spend, and your job is going to be to evaluate this germplasm. Heck, maybe you were just hired as a maize breeder down at UFV, or maybe you're working in Hohenheim, Germany, and someone just assigned you a biodiversity project. Who knows? They'll have different germplasm, right? So then I just say, look, you just begin breeding with whatever your short-term goals, short and long-term goals are, your breeding strategy, the resources, capital, financial, whatever that you have, budgetary, and you go to work, and you just start working, perspiring, and then again, right there, you're breeding with the end in mind. And I've got actually a couple examples of this in my own real life. About 5 years ago, we started from scratch a maize breeding program over in Uganda. Well, there was certain things we could use, obviously in Africa, lines through Simet and Naro in Uganda and IITA and other places. There's places to get lines and hybrids and synthetics, but a lot of them are not really very proven, and they may not be really what you want, but there is germplasm. That's where it comes from. Now, again, you could use hybrids. You can use a company's hybrids some places legally and breed out of those. Now, if you're working with something like maize, then your heterotic patterns are going to segregate all over the place, which complicates it, but it gives you germplasm. If you're working with cassava, you're working with a root crop, that's a different deal. If you're working with a turf crop, you're working with something like pearl millet or milo, you're working with things with male sterility, or apomixis. There's just a lot of things that come into mind here. I'm probably working with the easiest crop in the world, corn, as far as working with it. I've also, though, had the experience in the last 2 years to set up a breeding program from scratch for a company with a non-maize crop, and that has been a real eye-opener for me because I've had to do all these things, and the choice of how to get germplasm for that crop was extremely limited to not be encumbered at the end. So all of these factors entered in, and we're still evaluating as we go. Another thing is, are you going to use double haploid breeding in your strategies? Are you going to use recurrent selection? There's a lot of things you got to figure out. So when you start getting into this, building this germplasm base for the future, your future in plant breeding, there's an awful lot to think about. And I tell you what, it's the most important decision you will ever make, because you absolutely cannot make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Now that's a USA farm saying that I had as a kid, which means you can't produce something from nothing. So you need to have, if you want to win and you want to be good, and your company wants to win and they want to be good, and they want to help reduce food insecurity in the world, then the germplasm you use and how you use it is absolutely the most important decision the individual and the company or the country ever makes. None is more important. Now, next week on our plant breeding play number 2, we're going to get into the most important equation in plant breeding, and maybe one of the most important equations in the world when you think that people and animals eat plants, and that is the genetic gain equation. So I will leave you with that today. I want you to think about germplasm. I want you to think about how to improve what you have. You already have germplasm, but how do you make it better? And if you had to start from scratch, how would you do it? Thank you, and have a good day.